Hello, and welcome to Book Circle Presents and Join the Circus. Our heroes Gus and Doug have decided to spend their first night as members of the circus doing a little patrolling around the borders of the circus camp. They're up in some trees nearby when the steady breeze from the lake was stirred around here at the edge of the trees. Still, their whiskers picked up an approach, and they were starting to turn when a cold hand grabbed each at the back of the neck. They had thought they were magically exhausted, drained of chi, but just as their military lives had taught them new depths of physical fatigue, this assault showed them what it was really like to be out of chi. They went flat on their faces in the sand. It was not that they were too tired to raise their heads, nor that they tried to stir and nothing happened. They could not, for the moment, even remember how to stir, how to will the action. The hands on their necks pulsed warm briefly. They gasped, though it was not oxygen they needed or had been given. "What the hell are you doing here?" demanded Bana. No words came to Gus, but Doug muttered, "Patrolling. What the hell are you doing yourself?" "You show up just as the dread factor goes up," she replied, "and show that you're monsters. That confuses me. I don't like being confused. I don't like being assaulted. Gus, you okay, man? If he's—" "Don't worry, aren't you immortal?" she mocked. "He's just stunned. Answer." Doug pried a little more volition from the bottom of his brainstem and put a little growl into the reply. "We're what we say we are." To his surprise, she relaxed. "Why do you believe us now?" "Oh, I get it. You can tell while you're latched onto us." Shouts in the distance. Dogs barking. A gunshot. "There's your dread factor," Doug told her. They were still on their bellies with her hands on their necks. Now heat flashed in the touch. With disorienting speed, they felt normal, sort of, over a lingering hollowness. "Go," she commanded. Doug rose and dashed toward the noise. She was about to follow, but Gus's hand grabbed her ankle. "More," he demanded. "Cerdo," she spat. "Pig." But he held on. There was nothing wrong with his physical strength, and now he had enough chi to glue his will to his hand. She got ready to kick him off. He rolled over and sat up, keeping his hold. She demonstrated her supernal agility by staying upright. "It's for Doug, too. You just sent him into action with his tank near empty. I could feel. I was in the circuit. If that was guns, you'd give us ammo. We're in a rush. Give!" Her boot turned hot under his touch as she topped him off. "Okay, then." He jumped up and ran after Doug. He was not surprised to see Bana run past him. He figured she knew where she was going. He sought Doug. As he zigzagged through the vehicles, he realized his superhuman hearing had deceived him. The shouting voices were mostly muffled. The people were calling from inside their RVs and trailers, beating on doors and walls, shut in. He tore past several dim figures, zeroing in on Doug, by sound, by second-guessing him, by the fact that he could always find Doug, and came on him heaving and rattling at the door handle of an RV. People inside were beating on windows. "Where's a goddamn rock?" demanded Doug. "Or even a branch. There's nothing here but sand and grass." "Here," said Gus, clapping a hand on Doug's shoulder. "Supplies from Bana." As he had with the ghosts to keep them solid, he pushed the power. Doug felt what he was doing and pulled it in. Theano was right. It was pretty easy. "What's going on?" Doug asked, though Doug had been here bare seconds longer than he. "Everybody's trapped inside." Doug tried a leaping kick at the lock. Everybody? Then who were those people he had run past in the dark? Gus looked around the little temporary courtyard of vehicles. 5 or 6 figures stood still, watching. Ghosts. And he had passed more on the way here. The window beside the door broke and a set of chair legs thrust out. "Find Bana," Rook called from inside, and "Get us out of here," Theano demanded. Gus reached up and pulled the chair through, then began using it to clear the remaining glass from the edges of the window. Doug, meanwhile, went to find Bana. He headed for the loudest noise. Above the muffled shouting of the circus folk, two voices, male and female, were yelling at each other, and he thought the female was Bana. No more gunshots. That was good. Rounding a corner of the maze that was the circus by night, he charged through a still, dark figure and experienced a flash of chill. He brought himself up short, turned and grabbed the ghost, putting out a faint tingle of power for tangibility. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Who are you lot?" The ghost, a teenage boy in jacket and jeans, all tones of gray, stared back, astonished, then started to blur. Doug had no name to call or any other trick, so he just grabbed for its shoulders, already no solider than a stiff breeze, and pulled a gulp of cold energy out of the thing, letting it vanish. Someone sighed. Doug's ear cocked toward the sound, and he whirled after it. A man crouched against the side of the opposite trailer. A baton hung forgotten in his hand, and he stared at Doug. This must be Jude, one of the other guards on patrol that Johns had mentioned. Doug must have met him in the course of the day, so maybe the fellow wouldn't be too terrified. Jude apparently decided the same. Did you banish it?" he asked. "Yeah," Doug answered, or scared it off. "Look, everyone's trapped in their trailers somehow. Go get what's-his-name, the alchemist. If you can free him, maybe he can cope with metal locks and stuff. Don't worry, they're just ghosts." Jude nodded, started off in a crouching shuffle, then, with an act of deliberate courage, straightened his spine and trotted away. Doug continued toward the shouting. It wasn't continuous, but a dialogue. He would yell, then she would yell, sometimes several seconds later. In Spanish, or so Doug thought. At least he couldn't understand them yet. Bursting on the scene might not be the smartest move, so he slowed for stealth and kept to the sides of the trailers. As he skulked, he reflected how scary ghosts used to be. Chinese folklore had a rich supply of ghost stories, and as a kid, Doug had had his blood duly curdled by them. Fun to hear by day, hell to remember by night. Now, ghosts were just sad. Well, usually. Doug's grandfather had not been sad the night he died and stopped by to bid farewell. Yeye, Grandpa, had seemed almost gleeful. Doug could not always wrap his head around Gus's horror of being immortal. But when he thought of ages ahead, with no chance of seeing Yeye again, and the same eventually applying to Mom and Dad and the rest of his family, then he understood. Here she was, and here he was, the guy with the gun. They were a study in sliding silhouettes. Bana, in a black body stocking that was probably a costume by day, ducked and drifted behind packing cases. The guy, black jeans, black sweater, black balaclava, wandered the center of the area. He held a gun pointed up and turned slowly, stepping a slow, random waltz. From the way they failed to face each other, Doug guessed that it was too dark for them to see well. The angry bursts of speech continued. Doug could now tell that Bana was shouting in Spanish and the man in English, but he still couldn't make out sense. The words had a tingle, though, that had nothing to do with sound. When the man was facing away, Doug sidled up to Bana, trying to be quiet and hoping she would not yelp when he spoke. She only twitched violently when he murmured, "So vampires don't see in the dark?" "No," she retorted, soft even to his ears, "only cat monsters." Maybe the man heard. "Bana," he called, "you're getting noisy, my candy. Careless." Bana retorted in Spanish and immediately took 3 steps sideways. Doug followed. "Old boyfriend?" Doug asked. "That's sexist. He could be a creditor." "But he's not, is he? He sounds possessive." "Okay, right, he is. Bad romance." "Is he your sire, the guy who made you a vampire?" She sniffed, then stepped 5 strides while crouched, since the noise brought the man around to face them. Doug waited, then followed slowly. "His name's Darrell," she mouthed, making use of his acute hearing. "I knew it was him when I heard people yelling and pounding. Favorite trick of his. He has his ghosts bugger locks, then sends them in. Adds a layer of freak-out on the marks being trapped. Then the ghosts drain 'em, come back, and upload to him. Bang!" Too much talk. When Doug stopped scrambling, he and Bana were athwart the direction Darrell was aiming, tucked under a truck trailer. "I thought you were immortal," Bana said. "Why don't you just rush him?" "Doesn't work that way. There's pain and ages of lost time, so no thank you." And really, he'd only been told he was immortal. What he knew was that he'd been turned into a lion man and had learned to change back. "So he has trained ghosts?" "Yeah, mostly victims." "And you used to be okay with that," Doug reflected. "Well, maybe you saw the light. Reformed, you say. Anyway, we have to get rid of Darrell." "What's he want?" Doug asked. "You, I suppose?" "Yeah, under a binding oath. But also I ran off with the pot." Doug's mind danced over cauldron and marijuana before settling on the right meaning. "The takings? The collected chi?" She nodded. "As much as I could grab. That's what powers my acrobatics and healing and speed and stuff. He doesn't want to kill me because then it'd all go up in smoke. So he's saying he'd take an oath too, and we'd be partners again and forgive and forget. And he'll stop attacking my friends. Liar." Darrell had heard them again. He faced their way. Go ahead, idiot, Doug thought. Shoot again at moving targets in the dark and waste another bullet. But instead, Darrell spoke. "Bana, I hear you're breathing. You're getting tired." Doug felt power in the sentence. It was supposed to make Bana tired. "It's getting hard to keep up the stealth," he added. Doug rolled out from under the trailer, scuttled to the side, and glanced at Darrell to make sure he was still staring Bana's way. Then, "You wanted a rush, lady?" He drew his sword and leapt at Darrell. He must have made a noise, and Darrell was fast, faster than a lung mao. He hopped back and now wasted the third bullet. "She's not alone, Darrell," Doug bellowed. "You're outnumbered." You do voice magic, I do plain intimidation. It at least made him jump again. Doug crouched and dodged sideways, which was well, since it meant the fourth bullet was also wasted. Meantime, Gus had cleared the window frame of glass and helped Theano out. As he turned back to help Rook, she said, "Gus, listen, next time you meet—" She was interrupted by a translucent shadow that rushed upon her, arms reaching for her throat. She gasped, but then grabbed back. Gus suspected, could almost feel, that she and the specter were struggling in a tug-of-war for chi. Gus had had his arms up to grasp Rook. Now, just before he started to reach for Theano, something was pressed into his hand. A lighter. He continued his turn to Theano and the ghost. Click. Flare. "Thank you," said Theano as Gus went back to pulling Rook out of the window. "As I was saying, next time you meet a friend, count down 17 seconds before you strike." "Strike?" asked Gus. "The friend?" "No, of course not. Whoever needs striking." Meanwhile, Rook found his footing, grasped Gus by the shoulder, and said, "The ghosts are pawns. Their king is here. Take him out and the game is over." "Like Sauron," said Gus. "What?" "Like Sauron. When they took out Sauron, all the orcs folded." "Right. Now, Jadub, I adjust my pieces. Get on the roof and go look for the king. Irma and I will go get Harvey." Harvey was the alchemist. Irma was Theano. Right. Gus tossed the lighter back to Rook. "We got our own," he said, and clambered up the side of the RV. 17, Theano called. "Number of conquest." "Don't be afraid of the ghosts," added Rook. "I'm not, remember?" He heard a gunshot in the distance and headed for it, running from roof to roof. And another shot. And another. Something pale loped beside him. A wolf, misty, silent, until it said, "Where's your pal?" "Up ahead. Where are the dogs?" "Hiding, on orders, so as not to get shot." The wolf nodded to Gus, then flitted ahead, far faster than flesh and blood, not even bothering to put paws to rooftops. Gus grimaced, leaped the next gap, and kept running. Doug shook a ghost by the throat and reflected that he shouldn't get cocky. So far, ghosts seemed easy, but he supposed that not all were as feeble as the penny ante poltergeists he had banished, or minions like this one. The ghost was once a 30-something woman and looked to be an ordinary citizen. Probably she was one of Daryl's victims, and if she could still think at all, would welcome a more complete death. In any case, she was getting it. Doug flicked his lighter and closed his eyes against the flare to save his night vision. One more down. Ghosts weren't hard individually, but Daryl had so many working for him, and apparently brought them all. And here was Bana. She had been darting about in the crowd of phantoms, evading Daryl's sight and scaring off his ghosts with her own threats of predation. She had just yelled one of her Spanish insults, and Doug could tell at this close range that it was meant to sting, had some magical force in it, like Daryl's taunts about tiring, losing touch, getting clumsy, being stupid. He supposed it was good to have this dirty trick on his side, but he did not like it. "Cute with the burn," she said, sounding just a little winded. Ghosts hung about them, but dared not approach, just stared in silence. Not very enthusiastic minions, but then if they were his victims, they wouldn't be. "If I'd known, I'd have had a lighter on me," she said, surveying the spectral crowd. "So you did not know Daryl was coming?" Doug asked. "Just your rising sense of dread?" "Yeah, like I said, no details." "Then I have to say I see Rook's point. I suppose he could have doubled the watch, but beyond that..." The ghosts rushed him. It struggled in his grip hardly at all, and he could feel no resistance as he drew out the energy. Could you make a suicide run when you were already dead? Flare, and gone. He and Bana moved off so Daryl could not locate them from the blaze of the ascending ghost. They took different directions. Gus arrived on the rooftop overlooking the fight just after the flare. He tried to be quiet, but it was hardly necessary, between Bana and Daryl yelling at each other and the background moans and wails of the ghosts. Johns was already crouched on the edge. "There he is," he murmured to Gus, pointing with his muzzle at Daryl. But Gus had noticed Doug and started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The astral wolf leapt, not in an arc like a real wolf that has mass, but fast and straight like an arrow. Daryl broke off in mid-yell, grappling with the beast weightless but still strong and toothy. Gus wondered if he would even be needed. 4 Mississippi. But at 7 Mississippi, the gray shape winked out with a cry that snapped off before it could turn into a wail. Gus almost cried out. He knew from Greathouse that an astral form was in some way the projector's soul. What had happened to that one? With unsteady voice, knowing he'd paused, he picked up at 9 Mississippi. Doug did not see Johns vanish. He was coping with a rush of ghosts. They varied a lot in strength and palpability, and you never knew how much trouble they would be until they were on you. But once they were on you, the technique was always the same. He had worked it out by now. Pull all the chi out of them and burn them up with a lighter. Meanwhile, resist the other attackers passively, unless one or more were solid enough to be trouble, then turn on them. Questions came to him between rounds. Was his Lung Mao shape helping? He thought so. It scared and confused them. Were they really making suicide runs at him? He thought so there, too. If they were all or mostly Daryl's victims, they might well long for release. And though he probably had them under some kind of compulsion already, he was still yelling, "Get him!" frequently, which gave them a perfect opening to throw themselves on Doug and go out in a blaze. Why hadn't Daryl shot at him again? Was he running low on ammo? Of course, Doug was doing his best to be a bad target, ducking and skittering away after each fiery banishment. And maybe Darrell was busy with his continued argument with Bana. Was he, Doug, getting drunk on all the chi he was pulling off these ghosts? Certainly adrenalized or something like it. Did Bana feel like this all the time? In the light of the latest flaring ghost, he saw the faces of the others rushing toward him. There was no mistake now. The longing, the eagerness as intense as fear, and no trace of hate. He remembered his own time of slavery, his mind compelled by another. There was something going on here besides a fight. Suddenly, he saw his role in it. He stood tall and cried out, "Come to me! The doors of the horizon stand open!" And he held out the fire in his hand. And we'll find out how this fight concludes next time.